So let's talk about getting together an army of heretical spiky knights for Warhammer 40k, with an overview of starting a Chaos Knight army in 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of starting the faction for the 10th edition of the game. In the video we'll go over why you might want to start collecting Chaos Knights in particular in the first place, a few ideas for planning and researching an army, some ideas for kits to buy first and possible ways to expand from that, talking through the primary kits for the faction in turn, and then talking over some rules, the core things from the index, plus a couple of example army lists. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect Chaos Knights in the first place? In the lore, these guys represent fallen or tyrannical nobles, perhaps loyalist households gone renegade, or dread households that have supported chaos since antiquity. These twisted nobles pilot Titanic walking knight suits in service of the dark gods, often making war alongside other chaos armies, bringing terrifying firepower from vast Titanic walkers, often infused with demonic gifts and powers, and the number amongst the mightiest servants of chaos. Each dread household tends to have its own style and fighting preferences, and many are aligned to either iconoclasts or infernal, the iconoclasts being more sort of fallen nobles like Questor Imperialis for the loyalists, and the infernal knights being more Dark Mechanicus aligned, often augmenting their knight suits with demonic enhancements, though I'm sure for a terrible price. Models wise, the army is quite a recent one and a bit different to most factions of 40k out there. The Chaos Knights, like the Imperial Knights, are an entire army of vehicles and super heavy walkers. They only really have two primary unique model kits, but quite cool ones I think. The main boxes being the War Dogs and the Abhorrent Knight that can build several variants. They can also make use of quite a lot of other kits, Dominus Knights from the Imperials plus the Armigers, and a bunch of knights maybe a bit more aimed at the heresy, many of them made in Forge World resin. For a little variety you can add some summoned demon allies if desired. That can be one way to get a few foot troops to support your vast war machines. I'll come back to the kits a bit later in the video, but here's just a taster. Here's an Abominant Abhorrent class knight, a Psycho Knight covered in terror shades, fighting with an Electro Scourge and a massive Volkite weapon. The War Dogs are the bound vassals to the mightier nobles, packs of them acting as outriders and hunting down the enemy, perhaps in situations where the bigger knights can't maneuver quite as well. And otherwise there's the big Tyrant class, a fairly solid and enormous up-armoured gun platform, a walking bastion of firepower, and here's one example of the more heresy era themed knights in a Cerastus Knight Lancer, a long-legged and mobile knight charging in with an iron shield and a mighty lance. Compared with the first two, these aren't quite so obviously spiky or chaos themed. They can certainly add a whole load of flavour either via a suitable paint job or conversions. Price-wise, Chaos Knights are generally considered one of the cheaper armies in Warhammer 40k. You only really need a few big models and vehicles, and in particular for points on the board, the War Dogs don't do too badly, at least compared with their equivalent sort of troops choices in many other factions in the game. The Knights don't have any discount kits, but to be honest they're not too bad without. I feel like compared with some armies out there, there's only so many models that you can even collect with the Knights right now, unless you're really adamant and want to own every single Heresy and Forge World pattern Knight. The vast majority of the army can be built from 3 kits, and with some magnets it means that you can have the flexibility of the entire army, meaning that a very extensive force might not be quite as big as some ones from other factions. Finally, for gameplay, the Chaos Knights have their rules in Index Chaos Knights as a digital download at time of recording. Knights in general do play very different to most other armies in Warhammer 40k, generally big, tough, and covered in scary guns and melee attacks. Quite an easy army to use in game, as some enemy armies might just struggle to deal with the big stats and the entire army being focused on heavy weapons. That can be seen as somewhat of a negative though. A lot of games can feel just perhaps a little bit samey, and some possibly decided by just how well the enemy army can handle vehicles. If they're exceptionally good at destroying tanks, then you're probably in for a bad time. If they didn't bring enough big heavy guns along, then you might well just win. For the Chaos Knights in particular, their army rule focuses around spreading dread and despair within the enemy forces. They are arguably the army that makes Battle Shock most relevant for the enemy troops, making them test a bit easier and giving them some bad consequences from turn 3 onwards. But Battle Shock shenanigans do tend to be a bit more useful against certain armies than others, I'd say. Power-wise right now, they do tend to be fairly solid in game currently. Win rates are around about 50%, which is pretty much as balanced as it gets. The top army lists do tend to be a bit overly focused on their war dog units though, as opposed to the Titanic Knights. In any case, putting that all together, if you do want a big stompy army of heretical knights, and want every unit in your army to be massively dangerous and kind of tough to take out for the average enemy trooper, then Chaos Knights might be for you. If you do select Chaos Knights to be your main 40k faction, there's plenty of places that you can go to learn a little bit more about them. Index Chaos Knights at the moment is freely downloadable from Games Workshop, so it can be quite nice just to get an idea of their unit profiles and rules. You could put some army lists together, building them with things like Battlescribe, New Recruits, or Warhapedia, or perhaps Games Workshop's app. That can give you an idea for what sort of army you might wind up with. For trying out things, there's options like proxy models on the tabletop, maybe going for Tabletop Simulator if you're in for that. Both can be good ways to get an idea of how an army might play prior to actually making all the purchases. And then there's loads more that you can find out from the internet. On YouTube, there's plenty of content for Chaos Knights. I made a Chaos Knights index overview and a model tier list. I'll link those down in the video description. There's plenty of battle reports, painting guides, and lore on other channels. Though admittedly I feel like as Chaos Knights are a newer faction without quite so much established followings yet, there might be a touch less content for them out there compared with some. Otherwise I go looking for Discord servers, Facebook groups and subreddits themed to Knights or Chaos Knights. Generally they're pretty handy for just imbibing a bit of knowledge and asking some simple questions to current collectors. Just following along with the discussions that other players have can really get you up to speed on an army really quite quickly. It can be quite nice for painting and modelling inspiration as well, seeing all the cool things that people have done with theirs. Getting on to planning an army though, I feel like early on in the process it'd probably be helpful enough to plan a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list. Again, can just give you an idea of what sort of army you want to wind up with, and maybe make your collecting goals a little bit clearer. Knights perhaps tend to be an army that work a little bit better at higher points levels. Sometimes if you're taking them to smaller point games, they can have a bit of trouble with power scaling. For actually designing an army, I feel like most people just go out to make a well-rounded force, some big guys, some little guys. I feel like compared with some armies out there that have absolutely vast ranges, you're not quite as likely to get as much variation between different Chaos Knight forces. I guess the biggest decision is what sort of ratio of War Dogs to Titanic Knights you might want. Though the vast majority of people out there will tend to go for some of each, as opposed to a 100% skew, even if that is what's winning a lot of tournaments. Otherwise, can go for a more themed way to build an army, perhaps take one household from the lore and use their colour scheme and build them out how you might imagine that household might fight, or go for a bit of a gameplay sort of theme, whether you want knights to really focus on their shooting prowess, or a whole bunch of crazed butchers charging into combat, or a mix of both. You can just absolutely follow along with tournament lists and get towards building up the latest strong thing for the army though I would bear in mind that that canon does change. For households, a lot of people just choose to create their own. Chaos Knights have got an enormous amount of prospect for creativity. You can make some really unique custom arms. There are some fun lore choices out there. From left to right here we have House Herpetrax, who were lost in warp storms for millennia. When the Imperium finally made contact with them, they were met with resolute silence and held out against the great siege that the Imperium brought to them after that. House Lucaris is the next one in a sort of midnight clad. They were loyal to Horus since the early days of the heresy, launching out strikes from their storm-wreathed homeworld. And the last one I believe is House Commentis, an infernal-aligned knight household that actively sought out demonic possession, their homeworld falling to chaos in Millennium 33. Large tracts of their planet given over to summoning circles, and many foul entities lurk beneath the sands. Whether you go with one of these or create your own dread household with its lore and characters of its individual knight pilots is really up to you. At the moment they don't make any sort of in-game choice, Games Workshop preferring to go down the more detachment style system in current 40k. Talking of colours and heraldry to paint on the knights, I'd say perhaps the best place to start might be a smaller knight and maybe do a test scheme on a war dog as a first port of call. Maybe just best to experiment on something a little bit smaller and then you can make changes to it if it turns out not quite to be to your liking once it's done. Given that knights have quite such big carapace bits, I'd probably aim to get the majority of the legwork done by spraying them, either getting spray cans from Games Workshop or other providers or airbrushing. And one very common hack that massively speeds up the process is to kind of partly assemble the knights and don't glue on the armor plates, at least initially. That way you can spray their sort of metal exoskeleton in some sort of metallic tone, and then go for whatever colouring you have on the main armor plates, and then glue the armor plates onto the steel frame. There's plenty of good painting guides online and here on YouTube. Games Workshop created a few for certain knight households, but there's loads from other creators. I feel like while you can absolutely just assemble your Chaos Knights from the kit and use them as is, they can be a pretty awesome canvas for hobbying. I've seen all sorts of slightly mad conversions for them, unholy half-demon knights maybe fused with other kits, centaur knights with 3D printed legs, or converting the top half of the knights to be some sort of pulpit for a chaos demagogue to preach from. Even just a few basic conversions to add some chaotic themed bits to the more loyalist feel kits I think is quite nice. Definitely a lot of ways to add your own touch and personality to them. Getting on to miniature purchases though, and if I were starting Chaos Knights from a standing start, I think I'd go fairly solidly down this route. My first purchases for the army would be one Abhorrent class Knight and a set of War Dogs, basically the two primary kits for the army. That should be something in the region of around about 700 to 800 points worth of Knight. As mentioned, Chaos Knights don't generally have discount bulk buy style options. There have been a couple of ones in the past, like one of the Christmas box sets that had some more Imperial Knight themed kits, but you're kind of unlikely to find that at any sort of semblance of its previous price at this point, so I'd probably just jump in with these. Focusing on those kits, and first up for the little guys we have the War Dogs. They're £55, €70 or $90, a bit less with discount retailers in the video description as I'll get onto in a second. If you buy a box of War Dogs, it builds any two models out of the War Dog Carnivore, War Dog Stalker, or War Dog Brigand. Out of Index Chaos Knights, it doesn't build the Executioner and doesn't give you the Meltagun option for the Huntsman, though otherwise you could build it if you wanted a Stubber on top. Overall, I do quite like this kit. Quite nice models to work with in my opinion, really good theming, and a fun choice of different heads that you can give them to add a bit of personality. Seemingly since Chaos Knight's inception, mass War Dogs has often been the way to go. At least at time of recording, all of the above are very solid in game. Perhaps the Carnivore and Brigand particularly so. The Carnivore is just a very cheap, murderous melee machine, and the Brigand is a scary gun turret that hits on twos. Compared with most kits in Warhammer 40k, they've also got quite a good amount of points per dollar, which does mean they're quite helpful for building quickly towards an army of any given size. Perhaps the main downside for this particular kit is that they've been in somewhat short supply in the USA for really quite a long time now. For some reason, Games Workshop just keeps seeming to get small amounts of stock in and then sell out very quickly. Not very helpful if you're looking forward to picking some up. In any case though, if you're building an army of say 2,000 or 3,000 points, you're probably going to want this kit in multiples as you build up your household. Otherwise, the other major Chaos Knight kit is the Chaos Knight Abominant. It's the kit that's titled the Abominant, but it actually builds one of three Abhorrent class Knights, either the Abominant Psyker, the Knight Desecrator with its melee weapon and big laser destructor anti-tank gun, or the Crazed Knight Rampager, a full-on Titanic melee knight that nothing really wants to get in the way of. The only core index Abhorrent class that it doesn't build is the Despoiler. That's the one that's based on the Loyalist Questoris kit. This one's £105, $170 or €140. Gets you a great big towering Titanic knight, quite an imposing presence on the tabletop. This is basically the standard thing that most people would imagine if you talk about a Chaos Knight, and in theory should be the core of their army. As mentioned, versus the War Dogs at the moment, at time of recording they are a little underpowered. Games Workshop did give most of these good points drops recently, but maybe not quite enough to make them truly competitive against the War Dogs. I think realistically, since the points cut though, they're not really all that far behind, unless you're planning to try and take them to the top of a grand tournament or something like that. They'll generally do okay. Despite a bigger drop than most, I'd still probably prefer either the Desecrator or the Rampager to the Abominant right now. The AP0 of the main gun is just a bit of a letdown. When picking up these starter kits, I would certainly bear in mind the different options that you have to do so. Direct from Games Workshop is often the most reliable, but also the most expensive. My first port of call would typically be local gaming stores or other discount retailers online. Official independent stockists usually offering somewhere between 10 and 20% off new Warhammer models. For these ones, I do have a number of channel affiliate links down in the video description below. There are plenty of other options out there, of course, but for these ones in the UK, there's Element Games for 15% off. In Australia, Gap Games for just over 20% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% plus their loyalty program, and in the USA there's Wargame Portal for a big 15% off there. They've got quite a good back order system where you can place orders for things out of stock currently, and then they'll be shipped as soon as Games Workshop has some. Feel free to check out those links down in the video description. Anything bought after clicking them does help to support Auspex Tactics a little bit, and of course gives you big savings on the models compared with buying direct from DW. There are other options besides new plastic though. I'd certainly take a look at the second-hand market as well. Depending on your location, eBay can often be worth a look. Quality can be variable, and I'd certainly make sure that you have good pictures of what you're buying, but it could potentially save you some time, effort, and money. Could be a good way to land some Knight chassis, whether it's Chaos or Imperial. These days, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers often have some good stuff out there as well. Knights and Chaos Knights do seem to be perhaps a particularly popular target for people to create alternative theme designs for. Different heads and carapaces and weapons can give you a lot of fun theming there. One that I've come across before was Tarot Model Maker for some fairly fun Knight parts. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff that's compatible with the various different classes of Knights for some alternative sculpts. Given that they're the kits with the most theming, I'd probably go for the Abhorrent and the War Dogs first. I thought it might be worth talking through the rest of the Chaos Knight lineup. The other major class in the index is the Knight Tyrant, the big gun turret of a knight that's the same as the Loyalist Dominus class. It gets a big 2+ save and more wounds, and it can be quite good with the panoply of the Cursed Knights for the AP debuff. This one's £110 or $185 US, so a tiny bit pricier than the others, but it does have more points in game towards filling an army. I'd be a bit more tempted by the Volcano Lance sort of Castellan pattern over the Flamer and Harpoon version right now. I feel like losing Overwatch really did the Valiant version a disservice. Otherwise, for the Loyalist kits that Chaos Knights can appropriate, we've got the Armigers on the left here. These build you the Wardog Huntsman or the Wardog Executioners. In particular, it's relevant for the Executioner autocannons, which you don't get as options in the primary Wardog kit. I feel like they're okay general purpose shooting, maybe not so bad now they're significantly cheaper than the Brigands, though I still think that the Brigand will be my go-to gun turret little knight. Chaos Knights can also make use of the Loyalist Questoris equivalent, the Knight Despoiler. This is the big flexible one with the Gatling cannons, battle cannons, and thermal spears and things. The same price as the Abhorrent class Knights. I feel like it holds up okay, maybe just not having quite as much unique to sell it as the others, though you can make it into a very scary double gun knight with 2 Gatling cannons or something. Though bear in mind if you're planning on doubling up on big guns, only 1 copy of each comes in the kit. Finally, for the perhaps more Heresy and Forge World themed knights, there's 3 Cerastus knights in plastic right now. These are a bit more expensive again compared with the Tyrants or the Abhorrents. Fairly playable stat lines though. I have seen a few people using the Chaos Knight Lancer. It's hard to kill with its 4+ invulnerable save on its energy shield. They're quite fun, but often tend to be second thoughts compared with Games Workshop's focus on the main kits in each index and codex. Being primarily aimed at Heresy doesn't really do them much favours for the Chaos Knights. Otherwise, there's the Forge World Knights, the absolutely enormous Acastus type ones on the left, the Armiger Moirax, the Cerastus Atropos, and a couple of Abhorrent classes. Due to being cast in Forge World resin, they cost a lot more than their plastic counterparts. They're a bit more plain and less overtly Chaos themed compared with their themed kits as well. Some people do really like them as great big prestige pieces though. For the Wardog Moirax in particular, I might be kind of tempted to get a hold of some generic 3D printed energy guns for the arms. That could get you one at a lot cheaper than what you'd pay for Forge World. While we're on the subject of assembling knights, one thing that I would absolutely recommend from personal experience are magnets. I feel like perhaps out of any of the armies in Warhammer 40k, Knights and Chaos Knights are the single ones where you're going to have most value by learning how to magnetize and be able to swap out your weapons for other ones. There's lots of great tutorials on YouTube, just literally pick one and follow along. It means that rather than being locked to any one loadout or set of weapons, you get to just choose to swap them out, either for in-game diversity and different styles of play, or if the rules change and you might want to field, say, more carnivores or more Wardog Stalkers or something. It just means that you can basically have near every single style of Chaos Knight army ready to go just with a few models. I do find magnetizing kind of handy for storage and transport as well. I chose to go down the route of putting a big magnet at the waist joint of the Titanic Knights, which works rather well. Means that you can take them in half if it's easier to store them or transport them that way, and the rotation effect is kind of nice as well. If you wanted to try and do a bit of painting craftiness and really favour being able to swap things around for gameplay, you could maybe make it so your knights could represent a renegade sort of house. Perhaps go for a knight household that perhaps isn't quite so overly all the way down the path to chaos yet. Maybe model them in a little bit of a neutral way in which that they could represent either knights from chaos or the Imperium, and you might well be able to have a force that could credibly look like it could be from Imperial or Chaos Knights. Could maybe be one way to get 2 codexes worth of rules out of a single force, and could allow you to jump between the 2 armies for different gameplay experiences, though I feel like it's maybe just a few people who go down that route rather than the majority. In any case, as mentioned, I'd probably start to expand from that start of 1 Abhorrent Knight and a couple of War Dogs, going incrementally and doing things bit by bit rather than buying, assembling and painting an entire army all in one go. That could just burn you out unless you're a seasoned hobbyist already. As a first port of call, I'd probably work towards having one of each of the big knights magnetised, maybe an Abhorrent, Despoiler and Tyrant. Certainly the one that I'd be most tempted to get 2 copies of would be the Abhorrent class model. It's just more chaos themed, and you definitely could conceivably want maybe something like a Rampager plus a Desecrator on the table. Unless you are deciding to build some sort of tournament War Dog Swarm type list, I'd probably expand to something like 6 War Dogs alongside 3 big knights. That could give you a fairly flexible option to field a few different configurations, and then you could expand out there further if you wanted. If you wanted to build to game rules, it would probably be going for a heavier War Dog skew compared with big knights right now, carnivores, stalkers and brigands making up the majority of them. Not really the worst call in the world to be able to run a full War Dog list if necessary. There is going to be quite a lot of hobbying and painting time, and I feel like for most people you don't just get into Chaos Knights literally just for the little ones. Another option for expansion could maybe be adding in some allied demons if you fancied it. This I'd say would be a bit less of a stable part of the army. Allies rules really tend to change kind of heavily edition on edition, and even within the edition as they have recently. Currently the system seems to be that you can take 25% of your points in summon demon allies if you want, though as of the recent balanced data slates, if you want to take other demons then you need to take at least 1 battle line unit from the same deity, so if you wanted a bloodthirster you need to take some bloodletters. Currently, for gameplay reasons, Nurglings tend to be very popular indeed. Very cheap, can infiltrate and can deep strike. It makes them just excellent screening and secondary units that the knights don't usually have access to, though they do have the disadvantage of not being able to hold primary points. Otherwise, the demons data sheets could give access to units that are cheaper than a 140 point War Dog for holding down an objective for grunt work. Lesser demons like Blue Horrors or maybe some sturdy Plague Bearers could fill in there if you wanted. Or you could just go for another big threat to overwhelm the enemy with more things to shoot than they can handle, maybe a big greater demon like a bloodthirster, though as mentioned you would need to take some battle line along if you wanted to do that. I'd probably not overinvest on the demon side of things, and bear in mind that rules can change. The best demonic allies probably aren't that likely to stay the same way for an extended period. Cycling back to rules once more, if you want to get the rules for the army, Index Chaos Knights is currently freely downloadable on Warhammer Community under the download section, or you could use Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app for reference. The points costs are in the Murator and Field Manual document under the download section. They can change from time to time. And if you did want something physical for reference at the moment, you could pick up some index cards. It's the Knight Household ones that you can see here on the right, though these will likely only be particularly relevant up to the point of Games Workshop redoing the army for their Codex. Knights have had a few changes to be aware of in the balanced data slate as well. They can't overwatch anymore unfortunately, and towering had a rules change, meaning that it's not quite so powerful just to see through all sorts of ruins and things. It's just kind of helpful if you're nosing into a ruin and you can tower over it to see and shoot the enemy. The 10th edition Codex won't be out until at least autumn 2024. Currently it's unannounced and it could potentially be much later than that. Codex updates for 10th edition do tend to change the army at least a fair bit. The main edition will be different detachments for different ways to play for the army, though I feel like for an army with kind of limited model range like Chaos Knights, I do wonder how much variety they're really going to be able to create. Still though, in any case, I wouldn't wait for this, I just get going right now. Even if the Codex does come and rewrite a few things, maybe even gives us some sort of new class of knight if we're lucky, I start by getting a core of the army together, and then you can adapt it to the new book. Finally, let's take a quick talk about rules and a couple of example army lists. The Chaos Knight's core rule from their index is Harbingers of Dread. It does make them pretty much the army that goes hardest into battle shock out of any faction in Warhammer 40k right now. For the first 2 battle rounds, if you're taking a battle shock test within 12 inches of a Chaos Knight, you subtract 1 from the leadership test, so things are just a bit more likely to fail. And that combos really quite powerfully with their detachment rule, which means that you have to test battle shock if you've taken any damage at all within that range, meaning that there's going to be a lot more tests going around in the first place. Between those two, it can genuinely have an impact on opponents scoring objectives. I've certainly seen games that have had massive victory points influenced by certain key units failing. Perhaps the downside though is that it all tends to be a bit random and not really in your control that much. Sometimes units are just going to pass and there's nothing that you can do about it. Otherwise though, later in the game battle shock does start to become more meaningful. From round 3 onwards, enemy battle shocked units are -1 to hit if they're trying to target your units, and if you're targeting enemy units that are battle shocked, you get +1 to the wound roll there. Really quite powerful and damage and defensive debuffs, again the main downside being that it's a bit unreliable as to when they activate, but when they do happen it could genuinely be kind of game changing. Kind of a fun bonus rule, though sometimes it can happen just a tiny bit late in the game for most people's liking, and some games it's going to be awesome, some games kind of meh. Otherwise, for more interesting things out of their current detachment, there's a few stratagems that I think are kind of key. Diabolic Bulwark for changing a 5+ invulnerable save to a 4+1. That's often well worth 1 CP, and particularly so if it's a big Titanic Knight taking some heavy anti-tank fire. Knights of Shade is a somewhat common one for positioning. 2 War Dogs or 1 Titanic Chaos Knight gets to move through enemy models or terrain features. Knights generally don't get on too well with dense terrain, and that can be very big there. And with War Dog heavy armies at least, Dreadhounds can be an interesting damage dealer one, potentially allowing you to focus down one enemy unit with sustained hits, and if that unit's battle shocks, then it gets really quite impactful. Finally, out of the enhancements, maybe the single easiest one to use might be the Panoply of the Cursed Knights. Attacks against the bearer get worse AP by 1. Sometimes might not make the difference between being on your invulnerable save against shooting, but in melee it can be very meaningful, particularly on a Titanic Knight, which are often surprisingly fragile to enemy close combat attacks. Just for some example army lists, here's one competitive 2000 point army list from a recent tournament, this one apparently by a Dick van der Haast, who used it to take first at a tournament called the Alliance Open. As mentioned a few times already, competitive knight lists often tend to go very heavy on the War Dogs. There's a War Dog Stalker which has the character keyword, that one takes the tank busting Slaughter Claw plus the Demon Breath Spear, and then the rest of the list is really simple. 5 War Dog Brigands with the Demon Breath Spear and Chain Cannon, and 6 of the melee War Dog Carnivores with the enormous close combat stats, all of them taking Havoc launchers for actually a fair bit of indirect fire. Then for screening and secondaries, there's 4 sets of 3 allied Nurglings, good to pop up where you need them to do those missions. At the moment, I feel like it's never really a bad choice to take a fair few Brigands and Carnivores. The War Dog Brigand is 170 points for this profile, good objective control, really quite fast, but its main standout feature is getting a whole load of dangerous attacks hitting on a 2+, a Demon Breath Spear for 2 anti-tank shots at strength 12 with an enormous melter 4 if you can get in close, a chain cannon with 12 infantry killing shots, and if you attack the closest unit it gets up to AP 2, quite good at shredding infantry with OK saves. The Carnivore is one that I'm really not surprised to see spammed at 140 points. It's a fast-moving, melee-dedicated knight at 14-inch move, and in close combat it gets the choice between 2 fairly monstrously powerful damage attacks. Perhaps the headline act is the Slaughter Claw with 6 attacks hitting on a 2 at strength 12 AP 3 and a big damage d6 plus 2. Massively potent, armor busting there, plus good for tank shock, and you even get to reroll charges with these guys. At the cheap 140 points, they're exactly what you want on the front line. Just for one secondary example of a more balanced, Titanic-focused Chaos Knight list, this is something that you could do at the moment. Here I've got a Knight Desecrator, the one with the big anti-tank laser destructor and either a Claw or Reaper chainsword, a Knight Rampager that you can see pictured, brutal melee with either the tank busting Claw or the marine killing chainsword there. Being able to advance and charge once per game is really big. For a bit of dedicated anti-tank fire support, there's a Knight Tyrant with Volcano Lance and Exoplasma Cannon. That guy's taking the panoply of the Cursed Knights, so on his 2+ save with cover, you could have enemy attacks hitting at AP2, still saved on a 2+. And then to back up for some efficient vassals, we've got 2 of those Wardog Brigands with the Havoc launchers and 2 Wardog Carnivores, those to charge out and meet the enemy on the front line, screen and be a bit more expendable. I wouldn't pretend that this one's currently as overall strong as the first list at the current points cost, but given that Games Workshop updates points costs all the time, I wouldn't be too surprised to see further changes and maybe some other boosts for the Titanic Knights. In any case, hope that's been kind of helpful, a few ideas for collecting Chaos Knights in Warhammer 40k. Good luck to all of you who are embarking on an infernal quest to build this particular army. For experienced collectors, anyone who's got any further tips, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Always helpful to be able to guide new players a little bit more. If you'd like to see more like this, then I'll link my Chaos Knights tier list down in the video description. Could be one to watch for a little bit more discussion of the units, at least with regards to gameplay. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and check out those discount reseller links in the video description if you were thinking about picking up some kits anyway and you wanted to help support the channel. Finally, I will just mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way in which I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. The channel's Patreon is linked down in the video description, and you do get a few benefits for signing up to that, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.